Hi, everybody. This is literature from Monday, um, May 4th. And you should have by now, remember we changed the assignment on the last video. So you should have finished the last two myths in the book, Midas and Pygmalion, and done the quizzes on those two. So if you haven't, pause the video and take time to do that. Read both Midas and Pygmalion and take the quizzes, and then come back and we'll discuss them a little bit. The myth of Midas is one that you might have been familiar with before. Midas was a king. He loved gold. He had a lot of gold, but he actually was jealous of anybody else would have some that he didn't have. So he complains to Apollo that he thinks Apollo wastes his golden sunlight by scattering it on everyone. So Apollo comes to him in a dream and says, well, usually gods punish the kind of thing you've done, but I'm going to give you a break. So I'm going to grant you a wish. What would you like? And Midas says, I want everything I touch to turn to gold. So Apollo grants this. When Midas wakes up, he checks it out, see if it works, and lo and behold, he touches a rose, it turns to gold. A bee lands on his hand, it turns to gold. He decides to wear it as a ring. He starts turning other things to gold. Then his daughter runs up and complains she doesn't like the roses this way. So he tries to comfort her and touches her face, and she turns to gold. And even this doesn't faze him. He looks at her and says, well, this is unfortunate. I'm sorry it happened, but I have no time to be sad right now. I shall be busy turning things into gold. But when I have a moment, I promise I'll think about this. So he kicks up gravel in the path as he walks to his castle, and the nuggets turn to gold, or the stones turn to gold. The door he opens turns to gold. The chair he sits on turns to gold. The plates turn to gold. The cups, everything's turning to gold. And he's really happy with this so far. Then problems start. His servants bring him his food. He's careful not to touch the servants, but when he touches the food, it turns to gold. Everything does. He can't eat anything. Then he starts thinking about the fact that he's thirsty too, and what happens when he tries to drink. If he tries some milk or water or any liquid, it's going to turn to gold and choke him. So he figures, I can't drink anymore. And now he's scared. He can't eat, he can't drink. How is he going to stay alive? So he complains. Well, he goes back and says to Apollo, why have you done this to me? He says, I changed my mind. I will never desire gold again. I will never accuse the gods. Play, revoke that fatal wish. So Apollo has mercy and lets him go. But Apollo leaves him with a sign of his foolishness. He gives him donkey ears, which the king Midas hides by covering his ears with like a cone-shaped cap, kind of like a dunce cap, which he wears all the time. So Midas hides this for years, but the man who cuts his hair, of course, has to be able to cut his hair, so the hat comes off and he sees he has donkey ears. And Midas has sworn him to secrecy, telling him if he tells anybody, he'll die. He'll be killed. But the guy happens to be somebody who can't keep a secret, and finally it drives him crazy. So he goes to the banks of the river, digs a hole, puts his mouth to it, and whispers, Midas has donkey ears, and covers the hole back up again. Feels relieved by this. But the river reeds heard him, and they whisper things to each other and to the wind, and pretty soon everybody knows Midas has donkey ears. The king hears people saying this and knows who revealed his secret, and orders that the man's head, the barber's head, be cut off. But then he thinks, Apollo forgave me. Maybe I'd better forgive this blabbermouth. And he doesn't have him executed. Which brings Apollo back, and he says to Midas, you've learned the final lesson, which is mercy. As you have done, so shall it be done for you by you. So the donkey ears change back to normal ears, and now he's happy. His life's good. He's enjoying all the things in his life, including his daughter and his grandchildren. And he tells the story to his youngest granddaughter of how her mother was once turned to a golden statue. And he says, see, I'm changing you too. Look at your hair. It's all gold. But that just happens to be, she's a blonde, so she has golden hair. Okay, in the story of Pygmalion, he is an artist, a sculptor, and he works on the island of Cyprus, and he's doesn't care much about money. People come to him and like his work, so he lets them decide how much they want to pay, or sometimes he even gives the statues away. And so these things are driving the mothers and daughters of Cyprus crazy because he's a bachelor and he's happy that way, and he's wasting his talent by giving his stuff away or selling it cheaply. So they all think he needs a wife. So Cyprus is sacred to Aphrodite because that's where she first set foot when she rose out of the sea. So they pray to her, saying, uh, make Pygmalion marry somebody. So she appears to commit Pygmalion in a dream and says, I've been asked to marry you off. Do you have any preferences? And Pygmalion says, well, there is one person, but she's already married. And she says, who? And he tells her, you, that he's in love with Aphrodite. So Aphrodite's flattered. But she says, you still got to get married to somebody. So he says, did you tell them when? And he said, no, I didn't really set a time. So he says, well, grant me one wish. Allow me to do a master work, my greatest work. Let me do that before you force me to marry. Well, who is this? She asks, who the statue is going to be of? And he says, well, of course, of you, of Aphrodite. And so again, she's flattered, so she allows it. And he makes a whole bunch of little statue samples of her. And now he's got a fever that has to finish this job. So he keeps working at it all the time. He was thinking he would just stall her off and take years to finish this, but he gets caught up in it. And after he's made all these little statues, and then Aphrodite comes to visit him in his dreams or when he's awake, and so he can see her and she can model for him. And he gets done with the clay statues and he starts carving her statue from stone. And he wasn't going to hurry, but he gets caught up in it. He can't stop himself from working on it. Pretty soon it's done. And it's beautiful. And he actually kind of falls in love with the statue and puts his mother's jewelry on it. So Aphrodite comes and tells him she's very pleased with the work that he has done. So she's going to allow him to choose who his bride will be. And he asks to marry the statue. And Aphrodite says, no, it's got to be a living person. And he says, well, I've poured all my artistry and my lifeblood into making the statue, and I love her. I need to be together with her. And so he asks that he hold the statue, and she turn him into a statue too, turn him to stone, so that they can be together. And so Aphrodite goes in one better, and she brings the statue to life. And so now Pygmalion can be with the woman that he loves. Of course, her last comment as she looks at him, tousled, unshaven, with bloodshot eyes and stained tunic, Galatea, which is what he named her, says, now, my dear husband, it's time for me to work on you. She's going to whip him into shape. Two good stories. Okay. So we continue with the story of Ulysses. He's returned, and now he's together with his son and his servant Eumaeus. Ulysses came to the castle at dusk the next day and followed Eumaeus into the great banquet hall, which was thronged with suitors. He humped along behind the swineherd, huddled his shoulders and limping, kind of looking like a beggar, a crippled beggar at that. First thing he saw was a dog lying near a bench. By its curious golden brown color, he realized it was his own favorite hunting hound, Argo. It was 21 years old, incredibly old for a dog, and it was crippled and blind and full of fleas. But Telemachus had not allowed it to be killed because it had been his father's dog. As Ulysses approached, the dog's raw stump of a tail began to thump joyously on the floor. The tattered old ears raised, the hound staggered to his feet, let out one wild bark of welcome, and leaped toward the beggar. Ulysses caught the dog in his arms. The dog licked his face, shivered, and died. Ulysses stood there holding the dead dog. Then Antinous, one of the most arrogant of the suitors, who fancied himself a great jokester, strode up and said, what are you going to do with that dead dog, man? Eat him? Things aren't that bad. We have a few scraps to spare, even for a scurvy old wretch like you. Ulysses said, "Thank you, master. I am grateful for your courtesy. I am from Crete and—" "Shut up," said Antinous. "Don't tell me any sad stories. Now take that thing out and bury it." "Yes, gracious sir," Ulysses answered, "and I hope to have the honor of performing a like service for you one day." In other words, I hope to bury you. "Oh ho," said Antinous, "the churl has a tongue in his head. Well." He seized a footstool and smashed it over Ulysses' back. Telemachus sprang forward, blazing with anger, but Eumaeus caught his arm. "No," he whispered, "hold your peace." Remember, part of Ulysses' strategy is to test the strength of these men he's going to fight. Ulysses bowed to Antinous and said, "Forgive me, master, I meant but a jest. I go to bury the dog." As soon as he had left the room, they forgot all about him. They were agog with excitement about the news told by Telemachus that Ulysses' death has been confirmed and that Penelope would now choose one of them to wed. They crowded around Telemachus shouting questions, and he said, "Gently, friends, gently. My mother will announce her choice during the course of the night, but first she desires that you feast and make merry." The young men raised a great shout of joy, and feasting began. Ulysses returned and went the round of the suitors, begging scraps of food. Finally, he squatted near Eurymachus, a fierce young fellow whom he recognized to be their leader. Eurymachus scowled at him but said nothing. Into the banquet hall strode another beggar, a giant, shaggy man. He was a former blacksmith who had decided that it was easier to beg than to work at the forge. He was well liked by the suitors because he wheedled and flattered them and ran their errands. He swaggered over to Ulysses and grasped him by the throat. "Get out of here, you miserable cur," he said to Ulysses. "Anyone begging around here, I'll do it. Iros." He raised his huge meaty fist and slammed it down toward Ulysses' head, but Ulysses, without thinking, butted the man in the stomach, knocking him backward against the wall. "Look at that," cried Eurymachus. "The old souse has a head like a goat." "For shame, Iros. You ought to be able to squash him with your thumb." "It's exactly what I intend to do," said Iros, advancing on Ulysses. "It's a fight," cried the suitors. "A beggar bout. It's good sport." They crowded around the beggars, leaving just enough space for them to move. Ulysses thought quickly. He could not risk revealing himself for what he was, yet he had to get rid of this fellow, so he shrank into his rags as though fearful, allowing Iros to approach him. Then, as the great hands were reaching for him and the suitors were cheering and jeering, he swung his right arm, trying to measure the force of the blow exactly. His fist landed on the smith's chin. The suitors heard a dry cracking sound as when you snap a chicken bone between your fingers, and they knew that their man's jaw was broken. He fell to the floor unconscious, blood streaming from his mouth and nose. Ulysses stooped and hoisted him over his shoulder, and marched out of the banquet hall, saying, "I'd better let him bleed outside. It will be less unpleasant for you gentlemen." He draped the big man over a stile and came back. "Well struck, old bones," said Eurymachus. "You fight well for a beggar." "A beggar?" said Ulysses. "What's a beggar after all? One who asks for what he has not earned, who eats other people's food, uses their goods. Is this not true? If so, young sir, I think you could become a member of our guild tomorrow." Eurymachus carefully wiped the knife he had been using to cut his meat and held the point to Ulysses' throat. "Your victory over that other piece of vermin," meaning the other beggar, "seems to have given you big ideas," he said. "Let me warn you, old fool, if you say one more word to me that I find unfitting, I'll cut you into pieces and feed you to the dogs. Do you understand?" "I understand, master," said Ulysses. "I meant but a jest." "Your next jest will be your last," growled Eurymachus. Telemachus stepped between them and said, "Beggar, come with me to my mother. She has heard that you are a voyager and would question you about the places you have seen." "What?" said Eurymachus. "Take this stinking bundle of rags to your mother. She will have to burn incense for hours to remove the stench." "You forget yourself, sir," said Telemachus. "You have not yet been accepted by my mother. She is still free to choose her own company." Eurymachus played with his knife, glaring at Telemachus. He was angry enough to kill him, but he did not wish to lose his chance with Penelope by stabbing her son. So he stepped aside and let Telemachus lead the beggar out of the hall. "You've done well," whispered Ulysses to his son. "Another second and I would have been at the cur's throat. We would have been fighting before we were ready. Besides, it's time I spoke to your mother anyway. She enters our plans now." When he was alone with Penelope, he sat with his face lowered. He didn't wish to look at her, for her presence set up a great shuddering tenderness in him, and he knew that he had to keep himself hard and cruel for the work that lay ahead. "In this chamber you are not a beggar, you are a guest," said Penelope. "So take your comfort, please. Be at ease here with me and tell me your tidings. I understand you met my husband, Ulysses, once upon your voyages." "Beautiful queen," said Ulysses, "I knew him well, better than I have admitted. I am a Cretan. I was a soldier. When the war with Troy started, I went as part of the freebooting band to sell our swords to the highest bidder. We took service with your husband, Ulysses, and I fought under his banner for many years. Now his deeds before Troy have become famous in the time that has passed since the city was destroyed. Bards sing them from court to court all over the lands of the Middle Sea. But let me tell you a little story, though, that has never been told about Ulysses. I lay with him in that famous wooden horse, you know. We crouched in the belly of the horse that was dragged into Troy and set before the altar as an offering to the gods. The Trojans were crowding around, looking at this marvelous wooden beast, wondering at it, for such a thing had never been seen. But Queen Helen knew the truth somehow, and being a mischief-loving lady, always, she tapped on the belly of the horse and imitated the voices of the heroes' wives who were hiding inside. Not the wives, but the heroes. She did it so cunningly they could have sworn they heard their own wives calling to them and were about to leap out of the horse too soon, which would have been death. Now Helen saved your voice till last. When she imitated it, I heard Ulysses groan. I felt him tremble. He alone was clever enough to know it was a trick, but your voice, even mimicked by her, struck him to the heart, and he had to mask his distress and use all his force and authority to keep the others quiet. A tiny incident, madam, but it showed me how much he truly loved you. Penelope said, truly, this is a story never told, and yet I think that of all the mighty deeds that are sung about Ulysses, I like this one the best. Her face was wet with tears. She took a bracelet from her wrist and threw it to him, saying, here's a gift. It's small payment for such a great tale. Thank you, Queen, said Ulysses. My path crossed your husband's once again. My ship sailed past the island of Dawn. We had run out of water and were suffering from thirst. There we saw a marvelous sight, a fountain of water springing out of the sea, pluming and curling upon itself. We tasted it, and it was fresh, and we filled our water barrels. When I told about this in the next port, I learned how such a wonder had come to be. The enchantress, Circe, most beautiful of the daughters of the gods, had loved your husband and sought to keep him with her. But he told her he must return to his wife, Penelope. And after he left, she wept such tears of love as burned the salt out of the sea and turned it into a pure fountain of water. Penelope took a necklace from her neck and said, I like the first story better, but this one's lovely too. Ulysses said, thank you, Queen. I have one more thing to tell you. Your husband and I were talking one time about around the watchfire on a night between battles, and Ulysses spoke as soldiers speak of home. He said that by the odds of war, he would probably leave you a widow. Since you were beautiful, you would have many suitors and would be hard put to decide which one to marry. Then he said, I wish I could send her this advice. Let her take a man who can bend my bow, for that man alone will be strong enough to serve her as husband, as Ithaca as king. Did he say that truly? Truly he did. How can I ask them to bend the bow? They'll jeer at me. They may feel offended and do terrible things. Disguise your intention, Ulysses said. Tell them you cannot decide among such handsome, charming suitors, so you will let their own skill decide. They are to hold an archery contest using the great bow of Ulysses, and he who shoots best to the mark will win you as his wife. They cannot refuse such a challenge. Their pride will not permit them to. Now, good night. Good night, lady. Thank you for your sweet company. I shall see you perchance when the bow is bent. Good night, old wanderer, said Penelope. I shall never forget the comfort you have brought me. As Ulysses was making his way through the dark hallway, something clutched his arm and hissed at him. Ulysses, Ulysses, my master, my king, my baby, my lord. He bent his head and saw that it was an old woman and recognized his nurse, Euryclea, who had known him from the day he was born and who had tended him through his childhood. Dear little king, she wept, you're back, you're back. I knew you would come. I told them you would. Very gently, he put his hand over her mouth and whispered, silence. No one must know, not even the queen. They will kill me if they find out. Silence, silence. She nodded quickly, smiling with her sunken mouth, and shuffled away. Ulysses lurked outside the banquet hall until he heard a great roar from the suitors and knew that Penelope had come among them. He listened outside and heard her announce she would choose the man who, using her husband's great bow, would shoot best to the mark. He heard young men break into wild cheers. Then he hid himself as Telemachus, leading the suitors into the courtyard, began to set out torches for the shooting. Then it was that he slipped unnoticed into the castle and went to the armory where the weapons were kept. He put on a breastplate and arranged his rags over it so that he looked as he had before. Then he went out into the courtyard. All was ready for the contest. An avenue of torches burned, making it bright as day. In the path of light stood a row of battle axes driven into the earth, their rings aligned. Each archer would attempt to shoot through those rings. Until now, only Ulysses himself had been able to send an arrow through all 12 axe rings. Now Penelope, followed by her servants, came down the stone steps carrying the great bow. She handed it to Telemachus, saying, "You, son, will see the rules are observed." Then, standing tall and beautiful in the torchlight, she said, "I've given my word to choose as husband he who shoots best to the mark using this bow. I shall retire to my chamber now, as is fitting, and my son will bring me the name of my next husband. Now may the gods reward you according to your deserts." She turned and went back into the castle. The noise fell. The young men grew very serious as they examined the great bow. It was larger than any they'd ever seen, made of dark polished wood, stiffened by rhinoceros horn, and bound at the tips by golden wire. Its arrows were held in a bullhide quiver. Their shafts were of polished ash, their heads of copper, and they were tailed with hawk feathers. Ulysses squatted in the shadows and watched the suitors as they crowded around Telemachus, who was speaking. "Who goes first? Will you try, sir?" Telemachus handed the bow to a prince of Samos, a tall, brawny man and a skilled archer. He grasped the bow in his left hand, the dangling cord in his right, and tugged at the cord in the swift, sure movement that is used to string a bow. But it didn't bend. He could not make the cord reach from one end to the other. He put one end of the bow on the ground and grasped the other end and put forth all his strength. His back muscles glistened like oil in the torchlight. The bow bent a bit under the enormous pressure, and a low sighing sound came from the crowd. When he tugged on the cord, the bow twisted in his hand as if it were a serpent and leaped free. He staggered and almost fell. An uneasy laugh arose. He looked wildly about, then stomped away, weeping with rage. Telemachus picked up the bow and said, "Next." One by one the suitors came. One by one they fell back. Not one of them could bend the bow, much less string it. Finally, all had tried but Antinous and Eurymachus. Now Antinous was holding the bow. He shook his head and said, "It's too stiff. It can't be bent. It has not been used for 20 years. It must be rubbed with tallow and set by the fire to soften." "Very well," said Telemachus. He bade his servant rub the bow with tallow and set it near the fire. Ulysses kept out of sight. As they were waiting, Telemachus had a serving girl pass out horns of wine to the suitors. The men drank thirstily, but there was no laughter. They were sullen now. Their hearts were ashen with hatred. They didn't believe the bow could be softened, and Ulysses heard them muttering to each other the whole thing was just a trick. Finally, Antinous called for the bow. He tried to string it, but he couldn't. "It cannot be done," he said. "No," said Eurymachus, "it cannot be done. I will not even try. This is a trick, another miserable, deceitful trick. That shroud that is never woven, that Penelope works on all the time, the bow that cannot be bent, there's no end to this wife's cunning. I tell you, she's making fools of us. She will not be taken unless she is taken by force." A great shouting and clamor arose. The suitors pressed close around Telemachus, hemming him so tightly he could not draw his sword. "Stop!" shouted Ulysses. He cried it with all his force, in the great bellowing, clanging battle voice that had rung over spear shock and clash of sword to reach the ears of his men on so many battlefields before Troy. His great shout quelled the clamor. The amazed suitors turned to see the old beggar stride out of the shadows into the torchlight. He came among them, grasped the bow, and said, "I pray you, sirs, let me try." Antinous howled like a wolf and sprang toward Ulysses with a drawn sword, but Telemachus stepped between them and shoved Antinous back. "My mother watches from her chamber window," he said. "Shall she see you as cowards, afraid to let an old beggar try what you can't do? Do you think she would take any of you then?" "Yes, let him try," said Eurymachus. "Let the cur have one last moment in which he pretends to be a man. When he fails, as fail he must, then we'll chop his arms off at the shoulders so he'll never again be tempted to draw a bow with his betters." "Stand back," cried Telemachus. "Let him try." The suitors fell back, their swords still drawn. Ulysses held the bow. He turned it lightly in his hands, delicately, tenderly, like a bard tuning his lyre. Then he took the cord and strung the bow with a quick turn of his wrist, and as the suitors watched astounded, he held the bow from him and plucked the cord, making a deep vibrating harp note. Dumbfounded, they saw him reach into the quiver, draw forth an arrow, notch it, then bend the bow easily, powerfully, until the arrow head rested in the circle of his fingers, just clearing the polished shaft of the bow. He stood there for a second, narrowing his eyes at the mark, and then let the arrow fly. The cord twanged, and the arrow sang through the air and passed through the axe rings, all 12 of them. Then, paralyzed by amazement, they saw him calmly sling the quiver over his shoulder and straighten up so that his breastplate gleamed through the rags. He stood tall now, and throwing back his head, he spoke to the heavens. So the dread ordeal ends at last, and I come to claim my own. Apollo, dear lord of the silver bow, archer god, help me now to hit a mark no man has hit before. It is he, said Antinous. It's Ulysses. He died shouting, for Ulysses had notched another arrow, and this one caught Antinous full in the throat. He fell, spouting blood. No suitor moved. They looked at the twitching body that had been Antinous and felt a heavy, sick fear, as if Apollo himself had come to lose his silver shafts among them. Eurymachus found his tongue and cried, Pardon us, great Ulysses. We could not know you had returned. If we have done you evil, we will repay you, but hold your hand. Too late, said Ulysses. Your evil can only be repaid with your death. Now fight or flee. Then Eurymachus raised his sword and called to the suitors, Up, men, rouse yourselves, or he will kill us all as we stand here. Let us kill him first. And he rushed toward Ulysses and fell immediately with an arrow through his chest. But he had roused them out of their torpor now. They knew that they must fight for their lives, and they charged around across the yard toward Ulysses in a half circle. Ulysses retreated slowly, filling the air with arrows, dropping a suitor with each shaft he shot. But still they kept coming through the heaped dead. Now he darted backward suddenly, followed by Telemachus and Eumaeus, the swineherd, who had been protecting him with their shields. They ran into the dining hall and slammed the great portal, which immediately began to shake under the axe blows of the suitors. Overturn the benches, cried Ulysses. Make a barricade. The neatherd had joined them, and now Telemachus and the two men overturned the heavy wooden benches, making a barricade. They stood behind the walls of the benches and watched the huge door splintering. It fell. The suitors poured through. Now Ulysses shot the rest of his arrows so quickly the dead bodies piled up in the doorway, making a wall of flesh through which the suitors had to push their way. His quiver was empty. Ulysses cast the bow aside and took 2 javelins, but he didn't throw them, for the suitors were still too far away, and he had to be sure of killing each time he threw. A suitor named Aegelus had taken charge now, and he motioned to his men, Let fly your spears, first you, and then the rest. And after each cast of spears, let us move closer to the benches. The long spears hurtled past the rampart. One grazed Telemachus' shoulder, drawing blood from him. And Ulysses, seeing the blood of his son, lost the battle coldness for which he was famous among warriors. For the first time he felt a wild, hot, curdling rage rising in him like wine, casting a mist of blood before his eyes. Without making a decision to move, he felt his legs carrying him toward the great hearth. And there he stood and grasped the ring of the firestone, a huge slab of rock, large enough for roasting an ox. The suitors, charging toward the wall of benches, saw him rise like a vision out of the past, like some titan in the war of the gods, holding an enormous slab of rock over his head. They saw their danger, and they tried to draw back, tried to scatter, but Ulysses had hurled the slab. It fell among the suitors and crushed them like beetles in their frail armor. Only 4 of the suitors were left now. Now Ulysses and Telemachus and the 2 servants were upon them, one to each, and each killed his man. Then Ulysses and Telemachus raised a wild, exultant yell. Dappled with blood, they turned to each other, and Ulysses embraced his son. Well struck, he said. And then to Eumaeus he said, Thank you, good friend. Now go and tell your queen, Penelope, that the contest has been decided and the winner claims her hand. Father, said Telemachus, when I reach my full strength, shall I be able to bend the great bow? Yes, said Ulysses, I promise you will. I will teach you everything you have to know. I have come home at last. Okay, so, and we were looking at the different types of poetry during the week. Let's see, checking to see. I think this is it. Nope, wrong one. Let me try again. It's hard to see them. Oh, there it is, I think. Okay, types of poetry. A narrative poem tells a story. A dramatic poem Dramatic poetry is play that's written in poem form. Lyric poetry uses song-like words to express feelings. Epic poems are long narrative poems. So the poem I want to read today is a narrative poem, but it's also an example of sort of a subtype, which we'll add here, called light verse, which poets sometimes write just for fun, and they're entertaining, okay? And this poem contains an allusion again, not illusion like magicians do, but allusion with an A, which means that it's talking about something that the author assumes you're familiar with without him having to explain it, because it's a poem called Phaethon. So it figures you know the myth about Phaethon. So he writes, Apollo through the heavens rode in glinting gold attire. His car was bright with chrysolite. His horses snorted fire. He held them to their frantic course across the blazing sky. His darling son was Phaethon, who begged to have a try. He wants to drive the sun chariot. And Apollo's answer is, we better not do this. The chargers are ambrosia fed, Apollo says. They barely brook control. On high, beware the crab, the bear, the serpent around the pole. You think about that, what's he talking about? The crab, the bear, the serpent around the pole. He's talking about the constellations. That's another allusion. Against the archer and the bull, thy form is all unsteeled. But Phaethon could lay it on. Apollo had to yield. So Apollo's saying, hey, I don't think you can control these horses. Plus, the constellations themselves might fight you. Phaethon had made Apollo had made a promise, so he's got to abide by that promise. Out of the purple doors of dawn, Phaethon drove the horses. They felt his hand could not command. They left their wonted courses. So they leave the middle path and go all over the place because, he tries to get them down by his home village. And from the chariot, Phaethon plunged like a falling star after Zeus zaps him with the thunderbolt. And so, my boy, no, my boy, you cannot take the car. So the father explaining, hey, I better not let you drive the car on your own because look what happened to Phaethon. Okay, so kind of an interesting one. All right, so keep in mind that we've, now that we're finished with the heroes, gods, and monsters of Greek myths, I had mentioned we're going to look at starting a new book this week. So if you haven't been able to have your parents stop by and pick up the new novel, which is called The Bronze Bow, they are on the table in the entryway at the school, along with a folder that has the discussion questions for the novel that we'll go over each day after you've read a chapter and taken the quiz, and a packet of quizzes also. Not sure we're going to have time to finish the whole novel, but we'll get through a good portion of it. So maybe as soon as possible, if you can, have one of your parents stop by the school in the entryway between Mrs. Sterneman's place on the table and mine. I've got the copies of the books. It's called The Bronze Bow, and a folder for each of you that has quizzes and the study questions. So we'll start that tomorrow on Tuesday. So watch for a link or an email. It's got a link for the video for tomorrow. Thank you for watching today. We'll see you next time.